Dan raised the E question, the ethics question. In educational research, we think all the time about the very blurry line between prediction and proscription, or prediction, or even to use an even scarier word, tracking. It seems to me that you all have mentioned situations in which prediction with an eye toward proscription or tracking might be a positive thing, and also conditions under which prediction in order to channel behavior might be a negative thing. My question is, how in your different domains do you think conversations about appropriate use of data ought to be structured? Who ought to have them? How could we convene them in an ongoing way? And whose responsibility are those ethical questions?
I'm happy to start that if it would help. Well, first of all, I think anytime you're going to be prescriptive, and this is, my views are generally my own, but I think this one is pretty close to the official Accenture position as well, is that anytime you're going to be prescriptive with, say, AI, it's very important that two things. One is that you're realistic about what the AI actually can do and don't try to overextend, but even more important, that it has to be explainable. Okay, so black box AI that's going to, say, sentence someone, determine what the jail sentence for someone who's been convicted for is just not going to be fair. You're going to have to be able to explain why you're making the prediction, why you're making the prescription, and you're going to have to, it's going to have to be subject to interrogation, just as any decision maker would be. And oftentimes, I think it's going to be more appropriate for a long time for it to be more in an advisory role than in a prescriptive role. So human AI teaming and figuring out which things are more relevant to have people do versus have intelligent systems do, I think that's going to be key. But it is important to keep in mind that if you're worried about fairness, that the way we have things now with people in charge isn't always the most fair. So it's not just about risk, it's about trading off risk and benefit.
So oftentimes when people consider ethics, they think about issues of privacy. In education, let me take an example, which is not really a privacy question. You have a child who may be diagnosed learning disabled, and they become special ed. And then they have a label, and that label is public, right? And it follows them. And so there's a real concern about misdiagnosis. So now here, the hope is that data can help us actually line it up. So there's a lot of misdiagnosis because the categories themselves were legislative. They were not scientifically derived, and which leads to misdiagnosis all over the place because they're not real. So then you get a situation where you actually get a very good diagnosis. You believe that the treatment's going to help them, but the label's still going to stick. And so the big challenge in education is not necessarily what the systems do. It's how people interpret the labels that come out of the system. And in your work, you found this as well, where you came up with some findings about students believed a course was particularly easy because everybody's getting good grades. They didn't realize the reason students were getting good grades is because all the good students worked really hard in that class. So they misread the label. They then went into the course and they did badly. And so I think this is part of the challenge. It's not just how do we control the systems, it's how do we get people to interpret what those systems put out.
For me, I think the recognition is that when you're doing data science, you're involved in some larger ecosystem, right? Whether it's an organization or a team or politics or governance or anything. There's a lot of different people. They have often maybe even the same goal, but different ideas of how to get at it. And data becomes sort of really a question of, well, data for who? Who's it empowering? Who's it disempowering? And I think that really, at the end of the day, the ethics question turns out to be that. If you're using data to empower, say, centralized management to basically extract more work out of your workers, that starts to smack of Taylorism and unethical use. if you're using data to help teams reflect on their own processes and they have shared autonomy in the system and can actually make decisions more effectively, that sounds much more ethical to me. And I think that really, for me, what it derives from is this question of who's it going to be used for and what powers are they going to get? Because clearly, whenever you introduce some shake into the system, as Mitchell and I know well with some stuff here at Stanford, it's going to empower certain parties and it's going to disempower other parties. There's no neutral here. So I think just being reflective about it teaches us something.
That's helpful. The other reason I feel so grateful to be living at this fateful moment in global history at a university is I think ideally you want a wide variety of thinkers, social scientists, computational scientists, ethicists, having these conversations jointly. And universities are one of the few places where those different kinds of expertise come into contact with each other routinely. I often come away from panels like this being positively energized by the possibilities that new technologies and their affordances offer. But then when I go back into my day job as an educator at a university that, frankly, is a client of many digitally mediated services, I'm reminded of the fact that new technologies often come to organizations in the form of vendor-client negotiations, right? So the new stuff comes by a venture-backed a big idea with cool whiz-bangs using the latest technology to help you solve a problem you always had. And the client takes the form of a tailorist, bureaucratic, formal organization that makes decisions in a hierarchical way and is constitutionally resistant to change. So I wanted to throw that out as a way of suggesting, how do you guys, in your various roles, think about, am I right that the new stuff often takes the form of a fee-for-service endeavor, and does a sort of client-customer relation, are there some built-in limits to that mechanism for distributing new technologies?
Well, maybe since it's about how it plays out in what I guess are often industrial contexts, I can start there. I think you're going to have lots of stakeholders when you start to do a new initiative at scale, and some of them you're going to have your CIO organization that's going to often be the buyer if it's technology based, and you're going to need to make sure it works from that perspective. You're going to have the CFO who's going to be focused on how is it going to help reduce costs often. But you're also going to have the business owners who need to get things done and the workers who are going to be your ultimate users. So I think the most effective way to make sure it really not just gets purchased but gets sustained, renewed, and really adds value to all the stakeholders is that you have to be taking all of them into account and not abandoning a user-centric mode of really proving out what you do and tailoring it to the organization. So you have to start with the folks who are actually going to be on the business end of your technology, meaning the individual workers and the folks that they work closely with, and make sure it makes sense from their perspective. Otherwise, even from the vendor's perspective, it's not a sustainable relationship. You make the first sale, but you're not going to get the renewal. And we've worked with lots of vendors that do that. So I like to think that the right thing over time is also going to be the sensible business thing to do there.
I'm still chewing on the question. So I feel like for me, what I observe is that there are basically two layers. There's like who has access to the technology. So whether that's, the visualization system that you're licensing from someone or or your data warehousing solution or whatever. And then there's also the question of who has the knowledge. And when I was on a data science team as a postdoc before I joined at Stanford, that was actually a huge limiter. It was, you're at this huge tech organization, you have all this data and you want to run some analytics on it and you see something, you're like, this makes no sense. And then you go talk to the product team that built that, and they're like, oh yeah, the logging on that is kind of wonky, and it works in this situation on Mondays and Wednesdays after 5 p.m. And like it turns out that like without that like deeply contextual knowledge of the thing you're trying to interrogate, you're totally not going to get anywhere. Or worse, you're going to draw the wrong conclusions. And so I think there's you're right that there's this boundary of you have these command and control organizations negotiating with like scrappy startup with some cool data system. But at the same time, I feel like the actual sort of fault lines may lie elsewhere, between the people who has access to the data, who can query it, and then who has the knowledge to actually do meaningful queries. And that's much more commonly inside the organization.
Helpful.
I'll pass.
Okay. So let's open it up, and I'm going to ask that those who have a comment or a question, would you stand and introduce yourselves to the collective? And we've got at least one, maybe two microphones to help.
That's really loud. Good morning. My name is Fari Hindi. I'm actually the CEO of an insurance company in Dubai, out of the UAE. I've got to actually thank you very much for the presentation. It's really insightful, and thank you for the book. I really like that much better than that.
I swear,
I like that much better than the tote bag. So thank you very much for that. Well done. So actually, it's a question about something that we're kind of chewing on now. We've been on a fairly aggressive, disruptive journey in a very short time frame. We've reinvented our workforce. We're reinventing our business model. I can be more than happy to share with you what we're doing. But the part that's resonating with me is about the use of automation and AI with the workforce. So what happened is that we've actually changed the way by which the team is organized. We've removed the barriers. We've opened up the space. It's like set up like a garage. We've taken down the silos. We've enabled them with tools, Slack and Dropbox, and just really took them from the 1990s all the way to current. And it's been really an exciting journey just to see people come around and change the way that they operate. The question that I'm coming to is that we've, at least from my view, we've been able to reduce the contention about using AI and automation in people's jobs by explaining to them that by doing more automation and AI, you're actually going to be able to move on to better work and let the automation and the AI do the mundane work. So we're right at that kind of breaking point now where business users and experts are coming together to codify chatbots and expert systems, and it's taking away a lot of the mundane work. But what's happening is that we're finding ourselves with people operations or HR at the cusp of what do we do now? These people are actually going to have to reinvent their jobs. It's good. I mean, it's all good because now they're going to focus. I always tell them you're focusing on the higher level brain function now. But we're at that point where how do you, have you guys given any research or thought to how would you go about actually reinventing the workforce? Because now you've actually got that collaboration between machine and humans, and it's actually working, and people are buying into it rather than resisting it. We're past that, I'm not going to say entirely, but to a great extent, because they're seeing the benefit of it. The offload of all the call center to the chatbot, the offload of a lot of the mundane things to automation. Thank you.
I'm always jumping in first, so I don't want to steal other people's time, but I do have some thoughts on this. There's a lot of elements to what you just asked about, and we do focus a lot on the reskilling issue as a social issue. There's going to be more jobs, better jobs, but they're going to require different skills than the workforce often has now. And so everyone from social policymakers to corporate policymakers to individual workers need to be committed to the notion that there's going to be an evolution that needs to happen. I just want to focus on the part that I'm looking at more specifically, technical elements of that solution. I think both in our HCI group in Accenture Labs and our AI group in Accenture Labs, we're moving toward a focus of AI systems that amplify the individual worker, but that actually have a model of what the individual worker is going to need. So actually thinking that the worker and the AI systems need to start thinking about themselves as teammates, and your teammates are evolving. So when you're trying to help a worker get something done, you also should have a model of what they're capable of now and what they need to get a little bit more capable. That's, I think, left out of most current solutions. So what is the gradient of their skill trajectory that they're trying to climb in their skill trajectory, and what maybe you need to give them a little less help, and it's going to take them a little longer to get this thing done, but that's going to build their skills. So the system's going to be training workers are going to be training the systems, and we need to move to some systems that have some kind of meta level of reasoning ability about the notion of teaming itself.
Let me give a bad analogy.
That's chapter A, right?
That is chapter A. A is for bad analogy. The military have very complex machines, and they had to make this decision: do we train the workers, the soldiers, to be able to use the machine? And that was too hard. So they ended up making the machine simpler, a simpler interface. But then they realized when they did that the soldiers they lost all their adaptive skills because they were just sort of responding to the system. And so they came to me to ask, how can we make them more adaptive? Right. And so the soldiers and the staff and everybody in the military. And so I'm telling lots of important ideas, and then it turns out they have a zero error policy. So if you make a single error, you're punished. And under those conditions, you will get no adaptation or innovation. So the trick here, independent of AI or anything, is if you want these people to reinvent stuff, you have to create an environment in which they can make mistakes and have errors. That's going to be the number one.
Absolutely.
I'll have a briefer answer. I mean,
what? Was mine too long?
No. Sorry. I'm not implying pithy. I'm implying less to say. I think I would have to have some understanding of what are your goals and what are the needs. I mean, there are algorithms and systems that can do a matching of like, here's what we need and here are the people who we could sort of retrain into those paths. I wish Emma Brunskill were not traveling. She would have a lot to say about this. Maybe you can Google some of her work. But really at some level, this is an ecosystem level question where it's like you have your organizational goals, and I would sort of start there rather than saying, what do we have these people do? Say, what do we need to achieve? And then work backwards.
Is there a hand in the back?
Hi, David Pinsky with Hitachi. I think it was Professor Bernstein's slide. It had a statistics on selections of teams, and it appears managers are the worst at selecting the teams by an interesting factor, even over just sort of a random sampling. So kind of a couple of questions sort of keyed off of that is, one, especially in smaller companies, there isn't necessarily a way you can just sort of dynamically pick teams. You have the workforce you have. It's not, you got a pool of 1,000 people, pick somebody for a project. But managers are also the gatekeeper for this original selection of people into the group, which I don't think was part of that, because now you're not selecting for a team. It's now managers have perhaps predetermined their own failure based on the selection of the teams, since they're the ones that I guess are bad at making these selections. So I'm just curious, where do you go with that research? Like, are there ways, given the fact that managers are making these selections, and that probably won't go away realistically anytime soon, what from the research might indicate ways to improve that process, either for the people, selecting teams for people that are already there, or in terms of hiring practices to make sure that somehow that selection process ends up with better outcomes at the beginning?
Sure. First, a statistical footnote. The Dream Team condition, which outperformed the others, was pairwise better than all of the others. The other conditions were all not statistically differentiable from each other. So if you looked at the pairwise differences, they were I couldn't tell you that they were the same or different. There just wasn't sufficient evidence. I mean, the numbers, what I would say is the managers were probably no worse than some of these other conditions, but they were no better. I don't think that this means that managers don't play a role or aren't useful. I think the main point I was trying to get, that I think that I would take away from this is that actually, let me tell you the direct thing that I took away from this. People are risk averse. Managers were risk averse. So I think I mentioned something like, just with those 5 dimensions, 405 or so combinations, which, for an AI algorithm to explore would be almost instantaneous, but for people, that's a lot. And what we saw happen, and this is consistent with prior literature, was that the managers would stop after essentially trying 2 or 3 different combinations and say, yeah, it's probably good enough. And whereas the algorithm was like, hey, let's just try a few more. Usually got out, instead of 2 or 3, got out to like 7 or 8 different combinations by the end of, say, the 10 rounds. And I don't think that means that the managers were poorly skilled. In fact, I think they probably had better intuitions than an algorithm which had a uniform prior over everything. But some of the sort of cognitive heuristics we use work against us. This is something known as prospect theory or loss aversion that basically says we're more worried about screwing things up than we are about the potential gains we might get. And I think that was really what was going on. So maybe, to your concrete question of what should we be doing about and with managers, I think empowering them with the tools to be more reflective about their process and decision making, that's what I think would really amplify the situation. Just help us get over those cognitive biases about this will work or that won't work or this is good enough or it's not, or recognizing that I just changed one person in my team. I can still do things the same way, but maybe that person changed the entire social dynamic on the team. I think getting visualizations and I think it was Alex who was suggesting essentially early warning systems that things aren't going so well. That is where you're going to start to see managers playing a really important role, because they're the ones who are supposed to be thinking about these things as opposed to the team members who are just trying to focus on getting the stuff done.
Gentleman in the center? Yes.
Grumman. Very interesting topic. I'm like some discussion on how do you think the knowledge base will work, and how do you think maybe either the bidding for team members to join, and or how do we, if we're doing team members inside companies versus outside companies, especially the outside companies, if you're bidding for work, negotiations associated with similar things like IP and who has the right to sell.
And
this is to form ad hoc teams, you mean? Okay.
Yeah, there's unfortunately, it's a great question, but I'm having trouble figuring out how to answer it in less than an hour. I think there's when you're talking about going outside the organization to form ad hoc teams, there are several different issues you need to deal with. One is onboarding, just enculturating, getting the group to know each other, and getting the outside person who may be very skilled in general, but not skilled at the specific methods you use internally. So you need to have the technology to help with that. And then you have issues you were talking about, like IP protection. I think the IP protection is a very case-by-case issue, and there's both legal, technical, and kind of reputational elements to the right solution. If it's really IP that absolutely cannot leak, you probably can't use outside folks. But most IP's not quite like that. You need some level of protection. Like, you don't want them to be able to download the whole code base, but it's not like any piece of code is going to kill you. So there are solutions that we've looked at that I'd be happy to discuss with you for those kinds of protections. There's also legal protections that there's even authenticate. There are places now that I think are starting to spring up in India first, for example, but I think it will be more common if these ad hoc teams become I mean, where you actually physically go to a local place that authenticates you as the person who's doing the work, so that there's some level of protection like you'd have with your own employees that way. So it's a multi-pronged problem and a multi-pronged solution.
So I always like panels best when people are like disagreeing with each other in animated ways. So I'm going to basically be Bernstein squared. I'm going to sort of like try to amplify my actual opinion here more strongly than I might actually hold it. First, I think framing the question in this sort of risk-averse way of how do we prevent IP problems is totally the wrong way to go about it. And that's because, like, if you look at how it's very sort of a computer science-y point of view. It's like, oh, there's a possible bug, so we can't let that happen. And if you look at how we organize society, that's not how we do it. We say, like, don't steal from a store. That's a bug, right? If someone's stealing, that's a bug. But we're not like, we won't let you go into the store. No one can go into any store, right? Because that prevents all stealing. But this is very much the computer science point of view, is like, we're gonna sort of avoid that because that's our threat model. And again, I'm sort of over-characterizing here. But if you look at how we design society, it's much more on, assuming that most people will do the right thing and then having consequences and incentives for people taking the opposite point of view. If someone does steal, you're gonna get in trouble. And I feel like if you want to make progress here, I think you gotta sort of convince folks to take that point of view a bit, that like, it's probably not going to happen, and there will be serious consequences if there are.
In this, not in the spirit of disagreeing, because I actually agree with this, but just to give an angle on that, it's not just the computer science perspective, it's also the legal perspective.
Sure.
I spend a lot of time getting beaten down by our lawyers around innovations that pose risks. But I do agree with you that, to use your store analogy, if you were to propose a store when the one didn't exist, you'd probably get all kinds of pushback, like you're talking about. People could steal from it. So what you need to do is you need to find low-risk situations where you can show how incredibly useful a store is, so that then people turn around and say, oh, those guys all are using stores and they're doing great. We got to use stores too in our department for our products and so forth. And then people start to see the risk imbalance. At first, they only see the risks and it's change, and change is scary. So demonstrations of where the value is, I think, is critical. And then there has to be some balance of risks versus. And I will stick to the original position that there are situations where the risks are too high, and you can't allow it. But I think there, jewelry stores where the diamond rings are standing outside on stands to attract customers in are probably not going to work. But other things can be on stands outside.
I'm gonna make an intervention here in order to seed discussion into the break. I'm going to ask for, let's say, up to 3 comments or questions directly from the floor, one after the other, and then I'll give each of the panelists an opportunity to make, one closing contribution, either in response to that or something that can be continued informally. Okay? Yes?
This on? Okay. Justin Cruz. I'm with American Family Insurance, an insurance company operates out of the Midwest. So this might be a little bit of an odd question. I'm curious how you'll respond, but it was kind of triggered by one of your comments around the risk-averse behavior of humans. And it got me thinking about sort of behavior in the workplace, behavioral economics in the workplace. And when you think about, what's one of the biggest factors in any workplace in America and the U.S. is politics and emotion, traditional loci of control. Can AI and its impact on the workforce impact that? Can it change organizations in those kinds of ways? When you think about the de-siloing, digitization, how we divide work, how people come together, crowdsourcing, all these different factors, can that break down some of the longest held vestiges of workplace power in a positive way?
Wonderful. Another?
See you behind the column. I'm Matt Weber, Swiss Re, advisor to Swiss Re. My My question is the following, especially to Professor Bernstein. In a situation where we have a highly flexible, frequently changing organizational structure, flash organization, dream teams, etc., how do performance evaluations happen and measuring of goal achievements, and who sets salaries in a way that are perceived to be fair or maybe more realistically equally unfair to everybody?
Good. Is there one more? No? Okay. Yes, there is. Here. We'll take two more. Yep.
Rogan from Microsoft. So I have a question about when we have these kind of really dynamic workforces. I think a lot about the context of information people have, and where do you expect the knowledge to lie? Because right now, the knowledge lies distributed across your team, but if your team's constantly changing, where would that go?
And there's one more here, and then we'll let the gentlemen conclude as they wish.
I just want to dial up a level. So this is more a cross-border cultural question. So my firm advises governments in the Middle East on how to deal with AI and the culture and ethics of it. So everything that you've just said is spectacularly pertinent, except for the incredible potential for weaponization of data science and AI. And we tend to kind of underplay this when we're talking about corporations, because the next blue pill will come from the competitive advantage of AI. But at a national level or an international level, it becomes a little bit more dangerous. I'm wondering if the analogy to American industrialization back in the day versus Japanese industrialization, and there was a massive tussle between the two, well, both said it was the right way of doing this. I wonder if everything that you're developing here will ever become a common ground for countries and nations and different cultures to say, we agree this is the right way of doing things, as opposed to in China, this is right and this is wrong, therefore AI is going to make us do more of this and more of that, as opposed to what's happening in the United States, where this is right and this is wrong. It's just going to amplify it. I wonder if there is a way to look at this so we can collectively do something about it, specifically at the national level or the government level.
Well, that gives us some stuff to chew on, huh?
Yeah, great questions. Want to start?
Yeah, risk aversion is tough. If you say, if you're a company and you say, we will reward people for being innovative and creative, the level of innovation and creativity goes down because people don't want to take the risks. They want to follow the procedures to make sure they get the reward. So to really be able to create an environment that has people taking risks, I think some of it's the environment, but again, I asked you to look at K-12, look at how they got trained when they were in school before they got to you, and take some responsibility for that.
I think the risk aversion, weaponization questions are great questions, but I haven't thought too much about them. So just focus quickly on the issue of evaluation and who gets raises, promotions, and so forth, and also a little bit about where the knowledge lives. I think in terms of evaluation, relationships are going to change within the organization. There's going to be some loosening of coupling, which may pose challenges, but there'll also be a broader exposure to more different folks if we handle it right, which may improve fairness. I think one way to think about it is the notion of ad hoc teams when you're using external labor means more freelancing. But I think an even bigger impact within a large organization was going to be with the internal crowdsourcing, which means an increase in the importance of a freelancer-like mentality within the workforce. So employees taking more responsibility for the choice of assignments, and also negotiating a portfolio, building a portfolio that I think the technology builders can help this by creating the mechanisms for creating a digital portfolio. But just as freelancers think about the value of the work they do, not in terms of what they're just going to get paid for a job, but in terms of it building their portfolio, their skills, their marketability, I think that's the way that employees are going to think about the work that they do inside the organization as well, and the ability to be judged based on what you've accomplished, and the external validation of that's going to be crucial. I think in terms of where the knowledge is going to live, that is something that is going to have to be externalized much more as well. I think that's going to be a big challenge for technology, is how to be able to quickly transfer context, to capture context, and to make much of what lives in our heads external and easily available so that new teammates can use it. The good thing is that that will have a lot of other benefits in terms of democratizing the knowledge, helping with transitions when people leave the workforce and so forth. So it's a big effort that's needed there, and it will help ameliorate some risks, but also have some benefits over where we are now too.
Michael?
Well, I wish W were for wicked problems. Okay, I actually think my answer to your two questions are essentially going to be the same. Will AI diffuse office politics, and will AI amplify international politics? I think that essentially AI will become, just like anything else, a battleground over which power is negotiated.
Okay.
Who's in control of the AI? Who's feeding it the data? Who has the ability to take, to look at the results? Like within an organization, I would easily see, while I do think that there definitely can be some positives, but I do also see that, the choice to deploy this or not to deploy this will be used, for example, to reinforce existing power structures, probably more often than not. And internationally, I suspect that there are similar issues where I don't necessarily see like it's going to change the border of this versus that, but I do think that there's going to be a sort of, it's going to be used in sorts of power plays. It's like I guess I'm perhaps a little cynical on that point. To the question of these broader issues now winding in this question about what does reputation look like and recognition. I actually view this as a data science question, and as a designer and an engineer, something we can start to ask. As an example, we had a project that we've been doing over the last 3 or so years called crowd research, where we have hundreds of people around the world working together on large and open-ended research projects with my group and with other PIs, Sharad Goel in management science, a computer vision project. And this was largely intended as sort of an upward educational and access mobility opportunity. And yet when you have hundreds of people working together on a single research project, how do you decide who gets the great recommendation letters? Who gets first author, second, 10th author, etc.? So we basically turned it into a graph problem. We gave everyone in the group 100 points that they could distribute, you could do to everyone else based on the contributions they were making, say in the project or in this workshop or whatever. This creates a weighted directed graph, which we then essentially ran a graph authority algorithm on, PageRank. And this induced sort of an authority measure based on what was sort of democratic. What did everyone else think were the most important contributions? Now, I'm sure that voting encodes bias in some ways, cultural bias, gender bias, everything else that we know people to be producing. But on the other hand, it sort of stops saying, well, let's treat recognition and performance review in the sort of traditional way, because those things, rather than saying we can't do it because the old ways don't work, we say, well, what need are they actually filling, and can we fill them in different and interesting ways?
Right. Well, Alex, Dan, Michael, thank you.
Thank you.